I recall it was the first week of a decidedly cold December evening 1900, which found Holmes and I in our sitting room at Baker Street, each enjoying our early evening pipes and warming our hands by the roaring fire. If I have omitted mentioning it elsewhere in these chronicles, one publication that Holmes especially looked forward to each week was the Illustrated Police News. For Holmes, it provided him little pieces of criminal tat, whilst I enjoyed its unique brand of sensationalism, especially when Holmes, as was his wont, would find a particularly interesting story and read it aloud. That evening, Holmes read the story of a man attired as a priest who had presented himself to the clergy house of Father Murphy in New York. Introducing himself to the priest as Father O'Malley of a Chicago parish and showing his papers, he explained that he had been visiting the old country. He then asked if he may stay for the weekend before continuing his journey onto his parish. As is the custom of parochial houses, he was given a warm welcome and deposited his belongings in the upstairs spare bedroom before announcing that he might use his time in Manhattan to do a little shopping. Father O'Malley visited a local jewelry store and picked out 3 precious stones, which he explained to the jeweler he planned fashioned into a ring, which would be presented to the cardinal. He asked that the jeweler would bring the stones later to the clergy house, and he would provide payment then, as he didn't like to carry such large amounts of cash in dangerous New York City streets. Later that evening, the jeweler presented at the clergy house to be met by both Father O'Malley and Father Murphy. Father Murphy chatted to the jeweler whilst Father O'Malley inspected the stones. Stating, "Let me go get the money," he swiftly departed upstairs. After a few minutes, when he had not reappeared, Father Murphy and the jeweler went upstairs to find Father O'Malley's room empty, the window open, and, said Holmes, with a smile, he was never heard of again. I always enjoyed this aspect of Holmes' theatrical side and laughed heartily. Some crimes really are quite ingenious, Holmes. He was just turning to another story that he had earmarked for my amusement, when just at that moment came a knock at the front door, and Inspector Tobias Gregson's voice speaking to Mrs. Hudson before coming up the stairs. The Scotland Yard detective entered with a handsome, well-dressed, medium-sized man in his early 40s, with dark features and wore eyeglasses. Holmes bid them to take a seat, saying to the inspector, "I see Mrs. Gregson has gone to visit her poorly sister again." Gregson looked surprised and replied, "She has indeed, Mr. Holmes, but I cannot fathom how you would know that." Holmes chuckled quietly and replied, "Simplicity itself. When Mrs. Gregson is home, your boots are always well polished. When you are left to your own devices, they accrue a somewhat duller appearance, as you only quickly wipe them each morning." Holmes then relit his pipe and said, "What brings you to see me this cold morning? And indeed, please introduce me to this gentleman." Inspector Gregson spoke. "This is Mr. Thomas Upton, the proprietor of Charbonnel et Walker Chocolatiers of Bond Street. He brought me a curious case which seems befitting to your unusual talents." Holmes merely smiled and looked at Mr. Upton. The man addressed Holmes. "Your deductive skills are apparently not exaggerated, Mr. Holmes. I would be most appreciative if you would use these deductive skills into investigating my blackmailer." Holmes nodded and ushered them both into seats. "Please commence your account from the beginning, Mr. Upton." Mr. Upton said, "I have been the proprietor of Charbonnel et Walker for the past 5 years, and business has been excellent. We almost exclusively sell to the upper end of the market, and our patronage even extends shops like Fortnum and Mason's, and indeed to the Prince of Wales himself." I could only agree with Mr. Upton, as the late Mrs. Watson would always appreciate a box of their wonderful chocolates upon her birthday and Christmas, And indeed, I had my own particular favourite in their framboise, a delicious milk chocolate with a raspberry-flavoured fondant centre. Thomas Upton continued, "About 2 weeks ago, I received a typewritten note stating our chocolates would be poisoned if we didn't pay £5,000. Holmes asked, "Have you replied to any?" Mr. Upton replied that he hadn't yet. He stated that he hadn't taken the first seriously, and only became worried with the second, which he had taken straight away to Scotland Yard. Holmes asked, "Do you have these notes?" Mr. Upton looked at Inspector Gregson, who produced the 2 letters from billfold and handed it to Holmes. To his surprise, Holmes didn't take it. Instead, he asked, "How many people have handled this note?" asked Holmes. "Only myself and the inspector here," replied Mr. Upton. Holmes put on a pair of gloves and then, picking up a magnifying glass, proceeded to examine the note. We sat in silence for 5 minutes, whilst Holmes seemed to cover every inch of the paper, front and back. Eventually, he read aloud for my benefit. I will only read the latest and most relevant. It reads, "You've been warned. This is your last chance. Your chocolates will no longer be safe. A box for the Earl of Farncombe will contain death. To arrange payment, place an ad in the Standard personal column this coming Saturday stating, 'Thank you for my chocolates, Aunt Smith.' I will reply with further instructions. Do not get the police involved, or there will be serious repercussions." I started. Good Lord. Holmes's eyes looked at Mr. Upton. "Did this box get sent?" "No. I withdrew the entire order. The Earl never knew. I supervised and delivered his order myself, telling his staff that I happened to be passing." Holmes folded his long fingers together and stared into the fire for a long moment. "Watson, do you recall the case of Christina Edmonds?" "Indeed I do," I said. "The Brighton chocolate cream poisoner." "Precisely. In the 70s, she laced bonbons with strychnine and returned them to shops so they would be unknowingly sold. Madness and revenge were her motives. But this seems to be something else. A calculated extortion, but with an echo of her methods." Mr. Upton looked anguished. "Mr. Holmes, I am desperate. If word of this gets out, our business faces certain ruin. A whisper of poisoned chocolates and Fortnum's will cease their orders. The Prince's patronage would be withdrawn. This will destroy us." Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and regarded him with that intense, hawk-like gaze which had unnerved many a hardened criminal and overawed more than one innocent. "A curious business indeed," said he. "Now, Mr. Upton, before we move any further, I must have a thorough understanding of your staff. The blackmailer seems to have an intimate knowledge of your customer base. However, you will understand, I am sure, that in affairs such as this, suspicion must be laid evenly and without prejudice until the facts absolve or convict." Upton nodded gravely. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. There are 5 staff members presently employed at the shop as well as myself." Holmes waved a hand for him to proceed. "The 2 most senior are Mrs. Gordon and Mrs. Smith. Both have been with the business 8 years, steady, dependable, and entirely trustworthy. I would wager my life on their characters. Mrs. Gordon oversees the front of house and customer service. She has an eye for the wealthy and a tactful way with our patrons. Mrs. Smith does much of the packing and manages inventory with unflinching precision. I have never once found an error in her ledgers." Holmes nodded. "A strong start. I presume both are of good health and regular in their habits." "Very much so. Mrs. Gordon is widowed and lives in Kensington with her son. Between you and me, she has it rough as her son is a bit on the wild side. Mrs. Smith resides with her husband in a boarding house near Marylebone. She is the main breadwinner, as her husband had an industrial accident about a year ago. I increased her hours and wages not long after to help her make ends meet. Both women are punctual and modest in manner. They do not gossip, if that is your concern. Holmes gave a slight smile. Thank you for being so candid, Mr. Upton. Continue, please. The youngest of our staff is George Baker, 16 years old. He's been apprenticed to us for 6 months. Bright boy, polite, keen to learn. Lives with his parents in Clerkenwell. His father is a cooper. George is as smart as a whip, has a good nature. He is always asking questions about the craft, temperatures, crystal structures of the fondant, techniques for tempering chocolate. I've high hopes for him. Would he have access to your correspondence and client lists? Holmes asked. No, I do not believe so. He's never behind the desk. He spends his time either in the back kitchens or sweeping the floors. Holmes merely made a small sound at the back of his throat and gestured for Upton to proceed. Then there's Tom Mackenzie, a Scotsman, 31, lives in lodgings in Soho. He's been with us for 2 years. Excellent hand with the tempering machines, knows his ganache ratios inside out. Strong, dependable in his work but not in his punctuality. Ah, Holmes murmured. Go on. He tends to stay out late, bit of a night owl. He drinks, and I've heard, gambles at the track. He occasionally comes in worse for wear, but always makes up for it by working hard. There's never been a customer complaint on anything he's made, but it's not unusual for him to be half an hour late of a morning. Lestrade grunted. Drinking and gambling are never promising signs, Holmes. No, Holmes agreed, but not an indictment in itself, especially not in the absence of motive. Mr. Upton, the final staff member. Yes, Miss Orietta Lombardo. She is our most recent hire. She's 26, a foreigner, but a most diligent worker, even with her commitments at home. Holmes's eyes flicked up. Struggles, you say? And how long has she been with you? 3 months. She is careful, courteous, a little quiet perhaps, but excellent in all aspects. She mostly helps Mrs. Smith with gift wrapping, ribboning, and decorating display boxes. Does she handle money? Only occasionally. If we're busy and a customer wants to pay quickly, she will assist. I have always found her work exemplary when I have checked it. Holmes was silent for a moment. Tell me about her home life struggles. She lives in rented rooms in Pimlico. I've met her sister Gigliola, a cripple since birth who uses a crutch and sometimes apparently suffers frequent seizures. Orietta cares for her. They came over from Milan a year ago, I believe. Their father was a university lecturer who died, and they had no family left in Italy. Orietta came over and brought her sister Gigliola with her. She's very devoted to her. Indeed, in all aspects she is integrity itself. Holmes cocked an eyebrow. You've met this sister yourself? Yes, once. I called round to bring Orietta some sample cards she had left behind and required. The sister answered the door. Very pleasant girl. Pale, dark-haired, with a sweet smile, but little English. She walked with a heavy limp and used a crutch. She thanked me and gave a little bow. Her hands were trembling, I remember. She's lucky to have a family to aid her, said Holmes softly. Her integrity and devotion places her high in my trust and esteem, Mr. Holmes. Holmes sat back and drew at his pipe, eyes narrowing as he pondered. Have you received any further communications beyond the letters? Telephone calls? Personal visits? None, replied Upton. Only the letters. They were always typewritten, and as you can see, posted to the shop directly from various London locations. Have there been any actual tamperings with your products? Nothing evident. No complaints of sickness. No deaths. I now check every batch myself. But the fear is worsening and my nerves are tattered. It would ruin us if word got out. Holmes rose and began to pace, his long legs striding the length of the hearthrug. Mr. Upton, we are dealing with a mind that wishes to destroy your reputation through fear. We need to act quickly. Post your reply in standard in the affirmative, in order to gain us some time whilst I investigate. He continued, Mr. Upton, when is your next day, when all of your staff are present? Saturdays, always. We send out large orders every weekend. Then you shall see me at your premises this Saturday morning to view your workplace and meet your staff. Watson, if you are free. Of course. Good. Gregson, you may station an officer discreetly nearby in case events take an interesting turn. He returned to Mr. Upton. I shall need access to the rear of the premises, the stockroom, the kitchens, and all of the staff. Also, reply to the ransom demands as indicated, acquiescing to the demands. It will allow us time to investigate without fearing that the blackmailer follows through with their threats. With this, Holmes showed the inspector and Mr. Upton the door. Holmes turned to me and smiled. A most intriguing case, my dear Watson. One I must ponder over a pipe. With this, he sat back in his armchair and, reaching for his favourite pipe and tobacco, he closed his eyes. It was with no small curiosity that I accompanied Holmes early afternoon of the following Saturday to Bond Street. The frosts of December had left its glistening film upon every sill and railing, and the bright shop fronts gleamed beneath a pale winter sun. There is a peculiar atmosphere upon Bond Street at such an hour, a mingling of the carriages of the well-to-do, the quick-stepping errand boys carrying boxes tied with ribbons, and the watchful tradesmen standing within their doors, ready to pounce upon custom. Charbonnel Ed Walker's premises were situated in a block of tall, narrow shops, their windows already glittering with festive decorations. The front glass displayed tier upon tier of delicate confections, boxes of gilt and crimson stacked in tempting pyramids, each tied with a satin bow, and the trays beneath laden with shining bonbons, chocolate creams, and sugared fruits. To my untutored eye, the display was a triumph of taste and luxury. Mr. Upton awaited us at the entrance. His dark features brightened with relief at our appearance. He pressed Holmes's hand warmly and said, "You cannot know what it means to me to have your counsel, Mr. Holmes. My nights have been haunted with visions of poisoned chocolates in the hands of our patrons. Come, I shall show you every aspect of my business." Holmes inclined his head. "Lead the way, Mr. Upton. I am but an observer today, but an exact one, I trust." We were ushered inside, the doorbell chiming a genteel note. The interior was of polished wood and brass, with counters gleaming and every surface filled with orderly arrays of boxes, tins, and jars. A faint fragrance of cocoa and vanilla hung in the air, mingled with the sharper scent of peppermint. Customers came and went, mostly ladies in furs, accompanied by attentive servants bearing their parcels. Holmes and I were introduced as Mr. Jones and Mr. Mortimer, employees of the government who were inspecting suppliers to the various governmental offices and social events. Upton led us first behind the counter. "Allow me to introduce Mrs. Gordon," he said. A woman of middle years rose from behind a ledger. She had a pleasant, if careworn face, and greeted us with a modest curtsy. "Mrs. Gordon has been with us for 15 years, said Upton. "She knows every patron of note in London by name and half in the shires besides." Holmes gave her a courteous bow. "I should imagine, madam, that your memory for faces is as valuable to your employer as the chocolates themselves." She smiled faintly. "I do my best, sir. The clientele like to be remembered." Holmes asked her a few questions concerning the manner in which orders were taken, how accounts were recorded, and whether she had ever been requested to forward parcels without names attached. To all of these she gave calm, practical answers, showing a quiet competence. I could not but note the ease with which she spoke of titled clients, as though accustomed to dealing with persons of rank and fortune. Next Upton called Mrs. Smith, who emerged from a side room carrying a tray of ribboned boxes. She was of sturdy frame, with a grave expression, her dark dress neat but plain. Upton praised her unerring accuracy in accounts and inventories. Holmes glanced briefly at her hands, broad, capable, and faintly stained from the handling of wrappers and ink. She answered Holmes's questions with a precise brevity and returned quickly to her work, as if time were too valuable to waste. We were then introduced to George Baker, a fair-haired lad of 16, who blushed scarlet when Mr. Upton commended him as his work as an apprentice. The boy had an honest, open countenance. Holmes asked him how long he had been with the firm, what his duties were, and whether he enjoyed the work. George stammered his replies, betraying all the youthful eagerness of one anxious to please. Holmes smiled kindly. "A good apprentice is the making of a fine craftsman, my lad. Attend to your duties, and you will go far." The boy flushed with pride, and I saw him glance at Upton as if seeking his approval. Our tour next brought us to a tall, broad-shouldered man who was arranging trays in the rear kitchen. He wore a heavy apron, his sleeves rolled up, and his hair disordered. "This is Tom Mackenzie," said Upton, "the best hand with Ganache in London." Mackenzie gave us a brief nod and went on with his work, his large hands moving with a curious delicacy, at odds to his size as he poured a glossy stream of chocolate into moulds. Holmes asked him some technical questions about temperatures and the tempering process, which Mackenzie answered in a slow, thoughtful manner, his accent betraying his roots. He seemed a man more at home with pots and pans than with conversation, yet there was no mistaking his skill. Lastly, Upton conducted us back to the shop, where a young woman was busy at a side table, affixing ribbons and small decorative sprigs of holly to gift boxes. She was slight of figure, with dark hair coiled neatly, and wore a simple dress with a white collar. "This is Miss Orietta Lombardo," said Mr. Upton. She looked up and inclined her head politely, with her excellent, albeit accented English. Holmes asked one or two light questions about the volume of work during the Christmas season, which she answered readily enough, though she seemed eager to return to her task. There was nothing in her manner to suggest either nervousness or artifice. Indeed, she presented the appearance of a young woman wholly intent on ribbons and bows. Holmes, for his part, made no more of her than he had of the others, and soon turned back to Upton. "I would like to see your stockroom." We were led through narrow passages into a cool chamber where shelves rose to the ceiling, filled with boxes in every stage of completion. Holmes inspected the locks upon the doors, the seals on the packages, and asked to be shown the system by which orders were checked. Upton explained that Mrs. Smith oversaw the ledgers, while he himself verified all consignments of importance. "Have you dismissed any staff of late?" Holmes asked suddenly. "Only one," said Upton, after a moment's thought. "A man who was idle and given to drinking on the job. He left some 8 months ago." Holmes nodded, saying nothing. He examined the postbox at the rear door. He asked about the hours at which deliveries were received, who signed for them, and how packages were dispatched. His questions were minute and precise, yet delivered with so easy an air that they scarcely seemed interrogations. At length, we returned to Mr. Upton's office overlooking the shop store. Holmes stood silently for some moments, gazing at the polished counters, the bright array of confections, and the throng of well-heeled customers. "A curious business, Watson," he murmured at last. "Here we see the machinery of luxury. The smooth surface beneath, however, runs with a current of human greed. To poison a reputation is often more deadly than to poison a man. Observe how every client here purchases their goods with the serene confidence that it contains nothing but delight. Shatter that confidence, and the whole edifice crumbles." Upton, who had overheard, looked pale. "That is my dread, Mr. Holmes. The merest whisper, and I am undone." Holmes laid a hand upon his shoulder. "Courage, sir. We have made a beginning. I should like copies of your staff schedules for the past month, and any alterations that may have occurred." These were subsequently provided, and Holmes folded the papers, slipping them into his pocket. As we took our leave, he bade a polite farewell to each of the staff in turn. Mrs. Gordon returned to her ledger, Mrs. Smith to her ledgers and parcels, George to his sweeping, Mackenzie to his pots, and Miss Lombardo to her ribbons. Out in the keen winter air once more, Holmes hailed a hansom. "Back to Baker Street, Watson," said he. "There is something in this business that requires a little further quiet thought, and perhaps the assistance of our young allies." "Do you mean the irregulars?" I asked. "Precisely so. If there are threads here to be followed, they shall find its end. I must know how each of these worthy persons spends his or her evenings. For if danger lurks in Bond Street, it may not be found in the chocolates, but in the shadows cast about them. You suspect a staff member, Holmes?" "I suspect everyone, my dear Watson, but in all crimes always start with the most obvious, especially as the blackmailer knows of the shop's clientele." And with that, Holmes settled back against the hansom's cushion, his eyes half closed, the thin lips pressed into that curious smile which heralded the stirrings of his most subtle deductions. It was already dark when we regained our familiar sitting room in Baker Street. Holmes had sent for the irregulars, and the yellow glow of the lamp fell warmly upon the well-known disorder of papers, pipes, and chemical bottles, which ever marked my friend's apartment. Holmes hung his coat with a careless hand, paced twice across the hearthrug, and then seated himself, drawing from his pocket his pipe, pondering it. "At present," said he at last, "we have nothing but respectable lives and excellent chocolate. That will not suffice." Mrs. Hudson presently announced a visitor in the form of the irregulars' leader, Robbins. James Robbins was the present leader of the Baker Street irregulars, a tall, sharp-featured youth who had grown into the post once held by the redoubtable Wiggins, now promoted into more settled employment by Holmes's benevolence. In a moment he appeared, cap in hand, his quick eyes already alight with anticipation. "You sent for me, Mr. Holmes?" "Yes, Robbins. I require your services and those of your most enterprising lads." He succinctly availed Robbins of the situation, and asked that each of the 5 employees of Charbonneau Walker were to be followed when they leave their homes or work and thereafter, so far as it may be done without trespass or interference. No entering houses, no listening at doors, no questions asked. You will simply observe where they go, whom they meet, and at what hours they return. This is to be undertaken, and Robbins to report directly to Holmes each morning personally. Robbins grinned broadly. "Right you are, Mr. Holmes. Hawkins, Doolan, Smith, Jenkins, and myself will see to it." "See that they are discreet," said Holmes. "We are watching honest people, at least until proven otherwise." When Robbins had gone, Holmes relapsed into silence, lighting his pipe and gazing thoughtfully into the fire. For myself, I confess to a certain impatience. The danger to Mr. Upton's trade seemed real and pressing, and yet here were we, merely watching innocent men and women walk home through the winter streets. On the Sunday, Mrs. Gordon had left the shop at 6, took an omnibus toward Kensington, and entered her house. Hawkins watched the door for nearly 4 hours, but no one came or went, nor did she reappear. Mrs. Smith walked toward Marylebone and entered the boarding house where she lodged. About a quarter of an hour later, a man arrived on foot carrying a black doctor's bag. He was admitted, remained within for some 30 minutes, and departed again. Mrs. Smith herself was not seen to leave the house. George Baker walked home to Clerkenwell, stopping only at a baker's shop on the way. Tom Mackenzie spent the early part of the evening at a public house in Soho, then passed to a billiard room, and finally entered his lodgings shortly before midnight. Miss Lombardo took an omnibus to Pimlico and went directly into her ground-floor home, not emerging again. Holmes listened gravely. "A medical visit to Mrs. Smith's house," said he. "Interesting, but scarcely sinister. Continue watching." The second evening showed little difference. Mrs. Gordon again went home directly. Mrs. Smith walked out briefly to a chemist and returned. Later, at about 8, the same man with the doctor's bag came again, remained half an hour, and departed. George Baker attended a music hall and afterwards went home. Mackenzie drank and gamed as before. Miss Lombardo went to the British Museum, eating at a cafe before returning to Pimlico around 9 p.m. by omnibus. Holmes made no comment, save to ask Robbins to continue. Tuesday's report again showed nothing beyond routine. Mrs. Gordon home. Mrs. Smith home and save going out again to the local shop, was not seen again that evening. George Baker home. Mackenzie Tavern, billiards, lodgings. Miss Lombardo went from the shop, taking an omnibus home. When Robbins had finished his recital, Holmes sat for a long time in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "These people," said he at last, "live as openly as fish in a glass bowl. Yet blackmail letters are being typed, and written by someone with knowledge of Mr. Upton's business and patrons. We must therefore cast our nets wider, and see if there are any other fish to catch." Holmes had also continued to monitor the standard agony column, but nothing had appeared. The next morning Robbins was called for and received further instructions. "You will continue to watch your 5, said Holmes, "but in addition, you will allocate more irregulars to follow those nearest to them. Sons, husbands, sisters, dependents." He gave Robbins a list with the instruction to observe them only in public. "I seek movements, not confidences." Thus began a second broader observation. Mrs. Gordon's son was followed nightly through a round of theatres, coffee houses and billiard rooms, but met no one whose conduct suggested secrecy. Mrs. Smith's husband, an invalid, was seen only once, when he was helped into the street by a neighbour and back again. The doctor with the black bag continued his occasional visits, always alone, always silent. George Baker's parents led uneventful lives, his father passing each evening between home and workshop, his mother not being observed. Mackenzie, with no family in London, kept to his familiar haunts and companions. It was Hawkins, set to watch the crippled sister in Pimlico, who eventually brought a spark into the ashes. On Thursday, there was nothing to report. The sister was not observed. However, on Friday at nearly midnight, with Holmes and I about to retire, Hawkins was brought to our sitting room by Robbins with an air of restrained excitement. Robbins said, "Sorry to disturb you so late, Mr. Holmes, but I knew that you would want to be told straight away. Hawkins has information." "Well, Hawkins," said Holmes quietly, "what news of Miss Gigliola Lombardo?" "She came out late afternoon, sir, just before 4 o'clock." "With her crutch?" "No, sir. That's the queer part. She had no crutch at all, and she walked straight, without any limp. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Indeed, go on. She hailed a hansom from the cab stand and went to Knightsbridge, sir. I hopped on the next cab and followed. She got down outside a fancy French restaurant, L'Aigle d'Or, in Basil Street. She went in by a side entrance. And then? I watched and waited outside, sir. About 40 minutes later, I went in myself, pretending to ask for some water. I saw her clear as day. She was wearing a white apron and carrying a tray. She was working as a waitress. I could not suppress a murmur of astonishment. How long did she remain? All evening, sir. I stayed outside till past 11. When she came out, she walked steady as you please, hailed a cab and gave her home address. Still no limp and no crutch. I called for Robbins immediately. Holmes rose slowly from his chair and went to the mantel. He selected a pipe with deliberate care, filled it, and struck a match. For a moment he stood motionless, the flame poised, his thin face intent. Then he lit the tobacco and sank back into his chair, the first blue coils of smoke wreathing about his head. So, he said softly, our helpless cripple is no cripple at all, but a working waitress in a high-class French restaurant. And yet, subtly she can play her part by day for the benefit of those who must be deceived. He drew deeply at his pipe and closed his eyes. This, he added after a pause, is our first real break in the case. He rose suddenly and turned to Robbins. Holmes paid in full and added an extra guinea for Hawkins, thanking them for all their work, but their services were no longer required. When the boys had gone, Holmes resumed his seat. Tomorrow evening, Watson, we shall dine in Knightsbridge. Indeed. Yes, I find that French cuisine stimulates both digestion and deduction. And with that, he fell into thoughtful silence, smoking steadily, while the winter fog thickened against the windows, and the mystery of the poisoned chocolates seemed to be moving at last from conjecture towards some sort of revelation. The following evening found us stepping down from a hansom in the narrow, well-lit street just off Sloane Street, where the restaurant stood. The establishment presented an air of discreet elegance. Tall windows glowed with warm lamplight, and through them I glimpsed white tablecloths, polished glassware, and gentlemen in evening dress conversing over their wine. The sign above the door bore the gilded eagle of France. Holmes paused a moment before entering. Observe the clientele, Watson. Wealthy, fashionable, and above all concerned with reputation. The very sort of patrons who would shun an establishment at the faintest whisper of scandal. Indeed, precisely the sort who also indulge upon Mr. Upton's confectionery. Holmes's eyes twinkled. Just so. We entered. The interior was richly furnished with dark wood panels and crimson drapery. The low murmur of conversation blended with the gentle clink of glasses and the subdued strains of a violin somewhere toward the rear. Waiters in black coats moved with practised efficiency among the tables. We had scarcely removed our coats when Holmes's gaze shifted toward the far side of the room. There she is. I followed his glance. A young woman, looking strikingly similar to Orietta, stood near a table bearing a silver tray. She wore the white apron Hawkins had described, and her dark hair was arranged neatly beneath a small cap. There was no trace of a limp in her step as she moved swiftly between the tables. Gigliola Lombardo, I presume, I murmured. Holmes gave a small nod. She plays her part well. A maître d', a thin gentleman with a waxed moustache and a grave expression, approached us and conducted us to a small table near the wall. Holmes ordered dinner with the calm deliberation of a man who had no care in the world. During the course of the meal he spoke little, but I noticed that his eyes were rarely still. They travelled the room, observing the waiters, the guests, and more than once the movements of Miss Orietta Lombardo's sister. "She carries trays with a steady hand," Holmes remarked softly, not the least tremor. "You recall Mr. Upton said her hands shook when he met her?" "Indeed I do." When we had finished our desserts, Holmes beckoned over the maître d'. "I would like a word with Monsieur Dubois, if he would be so good." Holmes gave him his card. The man bowed and departed. Within a few moments a stout gentleman approached our table. He was perhaps 50 years of age, the restaurant owner, who was well dressed, though somewhat pale, with the air of one whose mind was troubled. "Mr. Holmes," he said politely, "I am Henri Dubois. I received your telegram earlier today. You said that you have some important information for me." "Yes, and let me introduce Dr. Watson. I have come about the blackmailer." The effect was immediate. Monsieur Dubois' eyebrows rose sharply, and a look of astonishment crossed his face, as it had mine too. He drew in a slow breath and seated himself opposite us, without invitation. "How did you know, Mr. Holmes? Not even my wife knows. Since 2 weeks now," said he continued in a low voice. "I have received 2 typewritten notes. They say that unless I pay £5,000, my restaurant's reputation will be destroyed beyond repair." "In what manner?" Holmes asked. The man leaned forward. "They claim that poisoned food will be served to my patrons." I felt a chill pass through me. "Good heavens," I said. Henri Dubois nodded miserably. "Exactly so, doctor. A single poisoning case in such a place as this would ruin me. The reputation of l'Aigle d'Or would never recover." Holmes regarded him intently. "Have the letters given instructions for payment?" "Yes. The latest was an advertisement in the personal column of the Standard newspaper acknowledging a luncheon booking. After that, they promise further instructions." Holmes leaned back slightly. "And have you complied?" "No," said Dubois. "Not yet. I thought the first must be some cruel joke. The second letter arrived only Monday. I have been out of my mind ever since, trying to decide what actions to take." Holmes's fingers tapped lightly upon the tablecloth. Holmes smiled faintly. "Don't worry, Monsieur Dubois. I should be able to catch your blackmailer before they can cause further despair. Leave this matter entirely in my hands now." Monsieur Dubois looked surprised but nodded his head, stating, "If you can help me, I would be entirely in your debt." At that point, Miss Lombardo's sister approached our table, carrying a tray of coffee cups. She placed them before us with a polite inclination of her head. Holmes looked up at her with his most courteous smile. "Thank you, mademoiselle." She returned the smile briefly before moving away toward another table. Holmes asked Monsieur Dubois the name of this attentive waitress. He replied that her name was Maria Russo, that she was Italian and had worked part-time for the past 3 months. She also looked after her sickly grandmother. He gazed at her with pride. "Such a caring and hard-working girl. I'm lucky to have her working here." Holmes nodded, merely replying, "Yes, it's very lucky she's here indeed." Holmes told Monsieur Dubois that he would let him know the outcome in the next couple of days, but not to worry further on the matter. Holmes glanced once more across the dining room, where the false cripple moved swiftly among the tables. "Sometimes," he added thoughtfully, "the most revealing disguises are not those worn in the streets, but those worn in a workplace." Holmes spoke little as we returned to Baker Street that evening. His manner had that peculiar stillness which I had long learned to recognize as the sign of some carefully forming plan. When at last we reached our sitting room, he sent at once for Inspector Gregson. The inspector arrived within the hour, stamping the cold from his boots and looking from Holmes to myself with keen expectation. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he briskly, "have you something for me at last?" Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "I believe so. Our blackmailer is clever, Gregson. Clever enough to have at play two very similar games upon the London stage." He told Gregson of the night's events. "So the Italian girl and her supposed crippled sister," said the inspector. Holmes nodded. "It is time we paid them a visit, quietly and early. If we are fortunate, we shall catch them unprepared." Inspector Gregson rubbed his hands together. "Very good. Where and when?" "At their Looper Street address. We shall arrive at dawn tomorrow morning." The inspector grinned. "A trap, eh?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed. Let's catch this nesting pair whilst they still sleep." The morning was bitterly cold when we met outside the cabmen's shelter in Pimlico, near where the sisters lodged. A thin frost lay upon the pavement, and the first grey light of day was only just creeping between the houses. Inspector Gregson had brought 4 constables, with 2 accompanying us, and 1 each waiting discreetly at both ends of the street. Holmes studied the building for some moments. "It is always a curious thing, Watson," said he quietly, "how the most imaginative schemes may collapse through a single flaw." Inspector Gregson, however, as was his way, had less patience for reflection. "Well then," said he, "let's have them." We mounted the steps and Holmes knocked sharply. There was no answer. Holmes waited a moment and knocked again. Still silence. The inspector frowned. "They're sound sleepers, if nothing else." Holmes looked at Gregson. "Time to force matters," as he produced a small tool from his pocket. Within a few moments the door yielded and we entered. The hallway was silent and cold and led to a sitting room with a small kitchen area. Holmes moved ahead with quick, light steps. "Their bedroom must be here," he said, indicating a door on the right. With a firm push of our shoulders, the door burst inward, and we rushed into the room, which to our surprise was empty. For a moment, none of us spoke. The small flat contained only the barest necessities: a table, 2 chairs, 2 narrow beds, and a crutch. The room had the desolate appearance of a place abandoned. The inspector swore softly. "They've cleared out." Holmes walked slowly across the room, his sharp eyes noting every detail, including the still warm fireplace. "Not many hours ago," he murmured. I noticed then that a typewriter stood upon the small table by the window. A sheet of paper had been neatly inserted between the rollers. Holmes approached it. "Well," said he quietly, "that is considerate." Gregson stepped forward. "What is it?" Holmes read the message aloud. "My compliments to Mr. Sherlock Holmes on his admirable detective work. We had hoped to remain in London longer, as we had worked months to build trust, but your interest in our affairs has hastened a sudden departure. I was not surprised to see you at my workplace, but when you turned up at Gigliola's workplace, we knew it was time to seek easier pastures. Let me leave you with advice, though. In future, a gentleman so widely known to the public might consider wearing a disguise when dining in fashionable restaurants. Yours with sincere admiration. O&G P.S. Don't look for us. We will never return to London." Holmes allowed the paper to fall gently back against the platen. Gregson stared at it in irritation. "Mocking you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's lips curved in the faintest smile. "On the contrary, Inspector, complimenting me." "They left during the night," said I. "Everything essential is gone." Holmes nodded. "The trunk is empty. The wardrobe contains only discarded garments." Inspector Gregson paced the room angrily. "Confound them! We were within hours of catching them." Holmes walked to the window and looked out into the pale winter street. I could not help but admire the coolness with which he regarded the situation. "You do not seem greatly disappointed, Holmes." "My dear Watson," said he, lighting a cigarette, "when a criminal takes the trouble to write such a letter, it usually means two things. And those are, first, that they are pleased with themselves, having triumphed in a manner over the famous Sherlock Holmes. And second," Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, "that they believe the game to be over." He tapped the edge of the typewriter thoughtfully. "Which, of course, is when the game becomes most interesting." Inspector Gregson looked skeptical. "They're halfway across the channel by now." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Perhaps." He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Remember, even the cleverest thieves leave crumbs upon a trail. And who knows, maybe our paths will cross again in the future."